I still remember the first time I realized my family didn't actually see me. Not really. It wasn't something a single comment could reveal. It wasn't cruel words or whispered comparisons. It was a quiet, persistent pattern, like a shadow following me even when I thought I was alone. My name is Harper Lane, and if you had walked into the Lane family estate in Charleston before the events that changed everything, you'd probably have assumed we were a storybook Southern family. The brick mansion on the Battery, the sprawling backyard that overlooked the harbor, vintage cars in the garage, and my father's name on every philanthropic board in South Carolina. On the outside, it was perfect, polished, Instagram ready. But behind the gilded gates, power had a hierarchy, and I was not at the top. That title belonged to my older brother, Mason Lane. Mason was the golden child from the day he was born. Teachers called him charming, neighbors said he was charismatic, coaches adored him. Everyone in Charleston knew him, and if you didn't, you soon would. He played football, baseball, tennis, all the sports that mattered, all the accolades that built a resume of envy before he even turned 18. Meanwhile, I learned quickly that my victories were always shadowed. If I got a scholarship to Stanford for academics, Mason's acceptance into Yale seemed the bigger story. If I won a local art competition, someone would mention Mason's sports trophy. Our parents were careful with their words, but actions spoke louder than any reassurance. Mason got the newest car every year for his birthday. I got a used sedan, which my dad called practical. He gave Mason free rein to network with business partners. My calls were often too ambitious for your age. By the time I turned 21, I was ready to leave. And I did. I moved to Atlanta, secured a role at a private equity firm that specialized in commercial real estate, and started a life that had nothing to do with Charleston's gossiping streets or the Lane family legacy. For the first time, I was Harper Lane, not just Mason's sister. I learned how to read balance sheets like poetry, how ownership could be transferred quietly, and how a little patience could turn the tables on people who thought they held all the power. 3 years ago, everything changed. My grandmother, Evelyn Lane, called me one Tuesday evening and asked me to come down to Charleston the following weekend. She didn't explain why, just that she needed my eyes on something important. When I arrived, she was sitting on the wraparound porch of her cottage tucked behind the main estate, looking as spry and sharp as she had 30 years ago. "I need you to see this, Harper," she said, sliding a manila folder across the weathered wood table. Coffee in hand, the smell of cinnamon and morning sun in the air, she told me to review financial statements and property logs for the Lane family holdings, 8 rental properties scattered across South Carolina and Georgia. As I dug into the numbers, my stomach sank. Over the last 2 years, nearly $500,000 had gone missing. Expenses claimed for maintenance or repairs were either inflated or entirely fabricated. Receipts were missing, photocopied beyond recognition, handwriting I recognized immediately. Mason had access, she said, because he wanted to learn the business. Turns out he had learned how to siphon it instead. I looked up at her. "Why didn't you confront him?" "Because your parents would defend him," she said, voice quiet but unyielding. "Say it's a learning mistake. Say he'll pay it back. By the time someday comes, there will be nothing left." Then she handed me a second folder. Inside were documents, a revocable living trust, Evelyn Lane as trustee for life, and me as successor trustee and sole beneficiary of every single rental property, plus quit-claim deeds ready for immediate transfer. All I needed was to sign and witness. "Why me?" I asked. "Because you understand what these houses are," she said, staring out at the water. "They're homes, not just investments. You won't gamble them away. You won't bleed them dry for vanity or toys. Mason would. Your parents wouldn't stop him. You will protect the tenants. That's why it has to be you." We went over the documents in detail. She walked me through every clause, every legal safeguard, every contingency. She made me initial every page so there could never be a claim later. When we finished, she poured a finger of bourbon and clinked her glass against mine. "Now it's done," she said. "Paper beats promises every single time. But Harper, keep this a secret. Until someone tries to take it, you stay quiet." I agreed. I burned the extra copies in her outdoor fireplace, watched the smoke curl into the early morning light, and drove back to Atlanta. Nothing changed on the surface. Mason continued collecting rent checks, boasting to the neighbors, posting pictures on Instagram like he owned it all. No one checked the county records anymore. I did, once a month, just to make sure. All 8 properties listed Harper Lane as the legal owner of record. Fast forward 3 years. My grandmother was gone, my parents were aging, and Mason was smug in his imagined empire. The estate was holding a family meeting, a celebration, they called it. I knew exactly what they thought, that Mason would be handed the properties, and I'd quietly nod along, smiling at the family unity facade. I arrived in Charleston Friday night, suitcase packed with all deeds, scanned backups, and the original trust documents, just in case. The next day, the main house was buzzing like a Wall Street trading floor. White tents in the backyard, catering trucks unloading, cousins chatting about Mason's big future. He stood on the porch with his fiancée, Sophia, champagne flute raised, expecting applause. I walked in, suitcase in hand, calm. Every face turned. Every eye caught the suitcase. I could see the fear start to ripple subtly. They had rehearsed a story of Mason's triumph, and here I was, the silent variable they hadn't accounted for. The meeting began, and Mason gave the usual speech. "Thanks to Mom and Dad for trusting me with the family legacy. These properties will stay in the Lane family." The room erupted in cheers. I waited. When the noise peaked, I rolled the suitcase forward, clicked it open, and laid out the quitclaim deeds and the trust in full view of everyone. Every signature, every notary seal, every recorded date shone under the chandelier. Silence crashed over the room like a wave. My father's face drained. My mother froze. Mason's smug grin vanished. This is impossible," he stammered. "Grandma, she didn't know." I looked at him calmly. She did. She made sure of it. 3 years ago. I'm the legal owner of record. The properties are mine. Paper beats promises, Mason. Always has, always will. The room stayed frozen. Sophia dropped her glass, stunned. Cousins and aunts gaped. The property manager's jaw hung open. My parents looked at each other, realization washing over them in slow, painful increments. Mason lunged for the papers. My middle brother, Eli, stepped between us, calm and steady for the first time in all our lives. "She's telling the truth," he said. The family meeting ended not in celebration, but in chaos, tears, and stunned silence. And that day, I learned something crucial. Being underestimated was my greatest advantage. The air in Charleston felt different that day. Not the warm, humid breeze that usually rolled off the harbor, but a tense, taut atmosphere, heavy like a storm waiting to break. I could feel it in the way my father's shoulders sagged, in the way Mason's jaw was locked so tight I could hear it in the room's quiet. My parents had spent a lifetime controlling the narrative, keeping up appearances, ensuring that Mason thrived while I remained a shadow. Now that narrative was gone, and all the careful illusions they'd built were crumbling at once. After the meeting, I left the Lane mansion quietly, the suitcase still in my car. My parents hadn't followed me. Mason was still shouting at Eli, trying to make someone, anyone, validate his fantasy of ownership. Sophia had disappeared somewhere between the kitchen and the garden. I wasn't surprised. The world doesn't like it when its illusions are shattered, and the first to crack are the people who built them. Driving back to my rental in the historic district, I thought through the next steps. The deeds were legal, the trust was ironclad, but owning the properties on paper was only part of the battle. If Mason wanted to fight, he'd try every angle: emotional, financial, even legal. I needed to make sure there were no cracks. Every lease, every tenant account, every property inspection report had to be double-checked. Every loose thread had to be tied before he could touch anything. When I arrived, I pulled out my laptop and began my audit. The 8 properties, ranging from townhouses in Charleston proper to rental condos in Atlanta, were each under my name and county records. Every bank account connected to rent payments had been updated. Vendors had new contracts listing me as the payee. Even the property manager who had helped Mason fabricate expenses now answered directly to me. I started with Charleston Row, the largest complex, 24 units, a mix of long-term tenants and college students. The first call was to the on-site manager, Maria, who had been with Mason longer than she should have. "Maria, I'm Harper Lane," I said. "I'm now legally responsible for these properties. I want you to send me every outstanding repair request, every lease renewal, and every tenant complaint from the last 2 years, no exceptions." There was a pause. Then, "Yes, ma'am," she said, tentative but respectful. She wasn't used to someone taking this role seriously. Mason had been reckless. I wasn't. Over the next week, I repeated the process for each property. Each time, the results were worse than I expected. Fake invoices, phantom repairs, inflated labor charges, all traced back to Mason. In one case, a roof repair that had supposedly cost $15,000 had never occurred. The contractor's real invoice was $3,400, but Mason had pocketed the difference. It was infuriating. Every tenant he had taken advantage of, every family forced to cover costs for his indulgences, was another layer of betrayal I had to untangle. Meanwhile, Mason's social media tantrum was in full swing. Within hours of the reveal, he posted a blurry photo of one of the properties with a caption that read, "Still the heart of the Lane legacy. Some people just don't understand what responsibility means. Hashtag family first, hashtag legacy." Comments ranged from supportive to questioning, but none grasped the reality. None saw that the legacy he was talking about had been legally stripped from him 3 years ago. It was a staged narrative for an audience too polite to dig. Sophia was worse. She had stayed silent for days. Then came a single Instagram story, a photo of her engagement ring with the caption, "Some battles aren't worth the fight." That was the first and last sign of remorse, not from her, but for the facade they had lived. My parents, predictably, called me separately. My mother's voice shook, mascara streaked from the Charleston breakdown. "Harper, can't we just work something out? Mason, he's your brother." I stayed calm. "Mom, I didn't take anything from him. Grandma Evelyn already did. I'm just enforcing what she entrusted me with. Everything else is your decision, not mine." And my father, he tried the old rational approach. Harper, the community, the neighbors, everyone. It's going to look bad. Mason was supposed to be the heir. People are going to think we... I cut him off. People don't decide what's legal. Paper beats promises, Dad. That's exactly what Grandma said. That's exactly what she meant. That weekend, I flew back to Charleston to inspect each property personally. I wanted to meet the tenants, ensure there were no disruptions, and make one thing clear: the Lane properties would never be mismanaged again. I started with a walkthrough at Pine View Estates, a small complex near the harbor. Old tenants greeted me cautiously at first, expecting Mason's charm or a lecture. I smiled politely and introduced myself as their new landlord, not a wealthy absentee, but someone who genuinely cared. Repairs that had been ignored for months were ordered that day. Roof leaks, HVAC problems, broken appliances, each addressed, documented, and billed fairly. Tenants began texting me directly, grateful, confused, but relieved. By the end of the first week, word spread quietly. Harper Lane was in charge, and she meant business. Back at home, I began the next phase: financial consolidation. I transferred accounts, consolidated management, and froze Mason's access entirely. Any lingering power he imagined he had was now gone. Within days, the reality hit him. He called my Atlanta number twice. The first time, I didn't answer. The second time, I let it go to voicemail. His message was terse. "Harper, you think you can just take this? You don't know what you're doing. This is family. We can fix it. Call me." I saved the voicemail. I didn't respond. Why argue when the law and Grandma's foresight were on my side? Then came the first legal salvo. Mason's lawyer sent a letter claiming the deeds were invalid due to undue influence and lack of capacity. I forwarded it to my attorney in Atlanta, who laughed politely. The deeds were notarized, recorded, and backed by the trust. Mason had zero standing. The irony? By the time he realized this, the properties were already generating rental income directly under my management, tenants none the wiser to the family drama. Sophia tried to intervene once, calling me through Mason's line. I let it ring. She texted a single message: "He's spiraling. Please don't ruin us." I didn't reply. The only thing being ruined was the fantasy Mason had built, the one he assumed would last forever. Meanwhile, Mason started making mistakes. He tried sending contractors to the properties, demanding access. I responded through my legal team, reminding them that only Harper Lane, as trustee and legal owner, could authorize any work. He raged on social media, posting screenshots of our emails and contracts, trying to shame me publicly. The posts quickly fizzled. The local community, seeing the properties maintained, tenants happy, and issues resolved efficiently, began subtly questioning Mason's competence. At home in Atlanta, I could finally breathe. The numbers were clean. Tenants were satisfied. Income streams steady. And Mason? Slowly, painfully, he realized the fight he thought he could win was already lost. But the family drama wasn't over. My parents were in denial. They hosted dinners where Mason tried to rally support, painting me as the disruptor or the outsider who had upset the family balance. I stayed away. I let the whispers and side glances roll off me. They could cling to illusions. I had control, the one thing that mattered. By the time Monday rolled around, Charleston was humming with its usual rhythm: harbor ferries, church bells, and tourists snapping pictures on the Battery. But inside my world, everything had shifted.
Mason's fury had gone from quiet disbelief to full-blown panic, and the first cracks in the Lane family facade were finally showing. I had spent the weekend meticulously reviewing every lease, vendor contract, and repair invoice across the 8 properties. Each discovery of Mason's mismanagement added a new layer of ammunition. Fake contractors, inflated repair bills, missing deposits. It was all documented, organized, and ready to be deployed strategically. The irony? He had given me the tools to destroy him without ever touching a legal loophole. Grandma Evelyn would have been proud. I started the week with targeted tenant communication. I drafted letters explaining my takeover, emphasizing continuity and professionalism, and assuring tenants that their rights and leases would be honored. Maria, the on-site manager at Pineview Estates, distributed them personally. The difference was immediate. Instead of confusion or fear, tenants responded with relief. Calls came in thanking me, asking for updates, and in one case, offering to provide testimony about mismanaged repairs under Mason's oversight. Mason, of course, noticed. His attempts to contact Maria were futile. She politely redirected him, referencing the legal authority of the trustee. He tried other managers, contractors, even vendors, but every door he knocked on was closed. His world was shrinking. By Wednesday, he had escalated to social media theatrics. A series of Instagram posts claimed I had no idea what it takes to run these properties, and that tenants were confused and misled. I didn't respond. Instead, I began quietly building a record of every complaint he had ever mishandled, every false invoice, and every misrepresented tenant issue. The week's work created a mountain of evidence, a digital dossier that would leave him no room to maneuver. Then came the family. My parents, predictably, reached out. My mother sent a long text, guilt-laden and pleading. "Harper, Mason is your brother. We just want the family to heal." I didn't reply. Healing requires honesty, not illusions. Mason, meanwhile, tried to recruit allies. Cousins and aunts who had cheered him on at the mansion suddenly received private calls, lavish brunch invitations, and stories meant to paint me as the villain. One by one, I watched them falter. When I confronted them, calmly and armed with evidence, they realized Mason's narrative was built on lies and self-interest. The whispers began to turn in my favor. By the second week, I had scheduled personal visits to each property, ensuring that tenants and managers saw me in action. The difference was glaring. Properties were maintained, problems solved, and communications transparent. Mason's chaos had been replaced with efficiency and respect. Tenants started directly acknowledging my ownership publicly. Rental apps reviews, social media mentions, even a few local news inquiries about improvements at Charleston Row. I let him stew. I didn't need to fight. His panic and desperation did the work for me. Then I made my first strategic public move. I contacted the local business reporter who had covered the Lane family properties over the years. Not to brag, but to provide facts. I laid out ownership documentation, recorded deeds, the trust, notary confirmations, evidence of past mismanagement by Mason, steps I had taken to restore order and protect tenants. The reporter was intrigued. The next morning, Charleston's top newspaper ran a feature titled "From Shadow to Steward, Harper Lane Restores Integrity to Family Properties." Mason's world imploded. Social media exploded. Cousins texted me in disbelief. Some expressed admiration, others barely concealed panic. Mason called twice that morning. I let both calls go to voicemail. He began sending frantic emails to my attorney, threatening lawsuits. All of them fizzled.
The beads were legally airtight, and my attorney's calm responses only added to his humiliation.
At home, I began restructuring management protocols. I implemented digital payment systems, direct tenant communication, and transparent repair logs. Every property had its own dashboard, accessible to me at all times. Any attempt by Mason to interfere could now be traced immediately. It wasn't just about money, it was about control, accountability, and proving he couldn't touch these properties again. By the end of the month, Mason's social life began collapsing. Sophia left him quietly, citing irreconcilable differences in priorities, a polite way of saying she had no desire to be dragged through the legal and familial chaos he had created. Cousins and aunts distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the unfolding disaster. Even my parents had started treating me with cautious respect, acknowledging the power of the trust and my strategic moves, though pride and denial still clouded their words.
I didn't gloat. I never had. My goal wasn't revenge for the sake of it, it was justice, accountability, and preservation of what Grandma Evelyn entrusted me with. Mason's downfall was collateral damage, inevitable because of his own actions. And then came the final straw. Mason attempted to forge new contracts with tenants, claiming false authority to access the properties. One tenant called me immediately, unsure how to respond. I calmly informed Mason that any further attempts to interfere would constitute trespassing and breach of federal tenant protection laws. I CC'd my attorney. The threat was real, backed by law, and Mason knew it. From that point forward, he disappeared from the property's operations entirely, reduced to angry social media posts and futile legal threats. Each failed attempt weakened his credibility further, leaving him isolated and desperate.
Meanwhile, I continued expanding the portfolio. Smaller properties in nearby neighborhoods were acquired using profits from the 8 main rentals. Each acquisition was strategic, keeping tenants stable, renovations minimal but impactful, and management professional. Slowly, Harper Lane's reputation grew beyond the family. She wasn't just Mason's sister anymore. She was a competent, respected, and unyielding property owner in her own right. The turning point came when a longtime vendor who had been complicit with Mason's schemes approached me. "Miss Lane," he said nervously, "everything I did under Mason, I want to make it right. I don't want to be part of the chaos anymore." I listened, verified his claims, and instructed him to reimburse the properties for losses. It was a small victory, but it sent a message. Anyone who tried to cheat the system would be held accountable. By the time Harper returned to Charleston for the 4th time that month, she knew the storm was almost over. But she also knew that storms, once started, leave destruction in their wake. Mason had burned every bridge he could, and the family's fragile illusions were crumbling fast. When she pulled into the historic district, the air smelled faintly of salt water and cut grass. On the streets, neighbors were busy with their routines, unaware of the quiet chaos unfolding behind the walls of the Lane estate. But Harper wasn't here for the streets. She was here to finish the job, and it wouldn't require violence or theatrics. She had law, strategy, and evidence on her side. The first call was to Eli, Mason's right-hand man for years, and the one who had witnessed every mismanaged repair and falsified invoice. Harper didn't confront him directly. She simply asked, "Eli, I need a full, accurate report of everything that went wrong under Mason's management. Every invoice, repair, payment, and tenant complaint." Eli hesitated. Harper could hear Mason's fear in the silence on the other line. Then Eli spoke quietly. "Yes, ma'am, I'll get it to you." By midweek, Harper had amassed an exhaustive dossier, Contracts, receipts, emails, screenshots of social media boasting, and sworn statements from tenants. Mason's previous attempts to manipulate the system to profit personally were all documented. The dossier wasn't just evidence, it was proof that Mason had been reckless, fraudulent, and entirely unfit to hold authority over the properties. She didn't release it publicly, yet. She knew timing was everything. Mason was already unraveling. The first public indication of his collapse came via the tenants themselves. At Charleston Row, a few long-term renters began questioning Mason's claims of authority after receiving Harper's professionally worded updates. "I thought Mason owned this building," one tenant said in a recorded interview with Harper. "Turns out he didn't even have the right to make decisions." Harper quietly documented these interviews, adding credibility and first-hand testimony to her dossier. Meanwhile, Mason's social media meltdown escalated. He posted videos of the properties, claiming, "I'm still involved despite the betrayal." The comments sections filled with ridicule, tenants correcting his statements, vendors confirming Harper's authority, and locals noting how efficiently the properties were now managed. Mason's image as a competent heir shattered almost overnight. Back at the Lane mansion, Harper's parents were fracturing under the weight of reality. Her mother tried to plead, "Harper, maybe we can find a compromise." Harper remained calm.
"Mom, there is no compromise here. Grandma made her wishes clear and I am enforcing them. Any disruption now would only harm the tenants she cared about." Her father, once so controlling, now looked beaten. He had spent years nurturing Mason's delusions of entitlement, and now each day brought a new reminder of his misjudgment. Harper's next move was subtle but devastating: financial recalibration. She personally contacted every bank and vendor associated with the properties, confirmed her trustee authority, and revoked Mason's access completely. Any attempt at interference now carried legal consequences. Within days, he discovered that the money he had imagined was his had been redirected to accounts he no longer controlled, with audit trails meticulously documented. Mason's desperation became personal. He called Sophia, trying to regain her support. She refused. She had witnessed his unraveling firsthand and no longer wanted to be part of his life or the chaos. His parents called, trying the emotional route, but Harper had anticipated this. "I'm not negotiating with anyone who tries to undo a legal, binding document," she said calmly. Then came the boardroom-style confrontation Harper had been planning for months. She rented a small conference room, invited key family members and vendors, and presented the full dossier. Screenshots, contracts, invoices, statements, everything meticulously organized. Mason was present, flanked by his lawyer, but the evidence was irrefutable. The room went silent as Harper methodically walked through every mismanaged property, every inflated expense, every tenant complaint. Eli and Maria, witnesses to Mason's incompetence, confirmed each point. Tenant statements were read aloud, vendor fraud was exposed. By the time Harper finished, Mason was pale, his lawyer silent, and the family stunned into compliance. "You thought this was your inheritance," Harper said calmly, looking directly at Mason. "But Grandma Evelyn entrusted these properties to someone who would protect them, not exploit them. That someone is me."
Mason attempted to interrupt. "You can't just... This isn't fair." Harper didn't flinch. "Fair doesn't matter. Legally, I am the owner and trustee. Morally, I am fulfilling Grandma's wishes. Your opinion doesn't change that." The room was silent for what felt like hours. Finally, Harper's father muttered, I didn't realize. I thought..." "Thought what?" Harper interrupted. That your favoritism would last forever? That neglect could protect him? It didn't. Paper beats promises, Dad. Always has. Mason slumped in his chair. His lawyer made a few weak suggestions about mediation, but Harper simply handed him a printed record of all correspondence, contracts, and legal proof. Every argument he could make was already nullified by the meticulous organization Harper had maintained since day one. The final blow came when public accountability hit. Local news outlets, alerted by Harper's professional and ethical management changes, ran stories highlighting improvements to tenant conditions, restoration of financial integrity, Harper's transparent management style. Mason's social media rants now appeared desperate and petty in contrast. Friends and former allies began distancing themselves, and Sophia publicly announced her disengagement from the family's internal drama. The sun rose over Charleston, painting the harbor gold, but Harper Lane felt none of the serenity it promised. Today wasn't about beauty, it was about finality. The 8 rental properties were fully under her control, Mason was legally powerless, and yet a final confrontation lingered. This was the day the Lane family would understand the consequences of their choices, and Harper intended to ensure they never forgot it. She arrived at the mansion early, before anyone else. The street was quiet, the old oak trees casting long shadows over the cobblestones. Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish, waxed floors, and tension, the same tension that had defined every family gathering for decades. This time, Harper didn't need a suitcase full of documents. She had everything in her memory and mind, and the legal system fully backed her. Her first stop was the family room, where her parents had gathered in anticipation. They looked nervous, their smiles thin, almost desperate. Her mother tried, "Harper, maybe we can—" "Mom," Harper interrupted, gently but firmly, "there's nothing to negotiate. This is final." She paused, letting her words sink in. "This is what Grandma Evelyn wanted, what she trusted me to execute, and it's done." Mason arrived last, flanked by his now mostly silent lawyer. His face was pale, jaw tight, eyes darting around the room. He carried an air of desperate defiance, but Harper had already seen the cracks in his performance. "Look, Harper," Mason started, trying for charm, "maybe we can find some middle ground, split some of the properties." She shook her head, calm, controlled, unflinching. "No, Mason, the properties are mine, the trust is binding, the deeds are recorded. Your claims are null. Your time running this portfolio is over." The room went silent. Even the walls seemed to absorb the finality. Harper didn't stop there. She wanted everyone to fully grasp the consequences of their actions. She moved to the mantel and retrieved the fireproof folder, the one that contained every deed, every trust page, every recorded stamp. Slowly, deliberately, she opened it and laid the documents on the table for all to see. "This," she said, voice steady, "is everything Grandma Evelyn entrusted to me. The legal owner, the trustee, the authority. Every decision, every property, every dollar is now under my control, and it's indisputable." Her parents paled. They had spent years imagining Mason at the helm, imagining him as the successor to the family empire. Harper's words, paired with the physical proof, obliterated that illusion. Mason's attempts at protest fell flat. He lunged for the documents, but Dylan, the quiet middle brother who had been standing back until now, stepped forward. "Stop," Dylan said calmly, placing a hand on Mason's chest. Mason froze. Dylan's voice carried authority, something Mason had never seen in him before. "You had your chance. It's over." Tears welled in her mother's eyes. "Harper, you could have just let us—" "I didn't let you," Harper said. "I'm enforcing Grandma's wishes. This isn't about you. This is about integrity, about protecting the tenants, about making sure the family legacy doesn't die because someone wanted short-term gain." Mason slumped in his chair, defeated, broken, powerless. Brooke, who had once been so gleeful, had sent back the engagement ring weeks ago, Harper had confirmed. Sophia had publicly ended ties with him. Cousins had sided quietly with Harper after reviewing facts. Mason's entire world of perceived control had crumbled, and Harper didn't need to lift a finger further. The family meeting ended with Harper distributing official notices to all tenants, financial institutions, and vendors. Every property had a point of contact, every lease updated, every account reconciled. Harper was meticulous. Her execution left no room for Mason to recover. Over the next few weeks, the consequences of Harper's strategy became even more apparent. Mason's financial mismanagement caught up to him. IRS notices arrived, penalties tallied, and liens placed on assets still under his name. He was forced into a long-term repayment plan. Her parents, forced to downsize, relocated to a modest condo, selling boats, luxury cars, and unnecessary assets to cover debts and lifestyle changes. Harper expanded the portfolio further, acquiring smaller properties in adjacent neighborhoods, all fully aligned with her management philosophy. Tenants were happy, repairs timely, communication transparent, and occupancy rates higher than ever. Vendors, now under Harper's clear and ethical leadership, reconciled losses caused by Mason, restoring credibility and stability to the business. Harper never gloating. She didn't need to. Every action she took speaks louder than any victory speech. The lesson had been delivered. Integrity, preparation, and legal authority always win over entitlement, deception, and favoritism. Months later, she stood on her balcony in Charleston, the harbor sparkling below. The little girl who had once begged for math tutoring while Mason received every advantage smiled to herself. Life had come full circle, and for the first time she felt completely at peace. A text from Dilling appeared. "You did it. Everything's stable. Finally." Harper didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence was her victory lap. Grandma Evelyn's words echoed in her mind. Paper beats promises every single time. And Harper knew that some doors, once closed, would never open again. Mason remained a cautionary tale, a shadow of what could have been. Harper's family had been forced to confront reality and recalibrate their expectations. And Harper? She had her peace, her properties, her tenants, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from executing a plan perfectly, without haste, without emotion, just law, logic, and loyalty to the right legacy. She turned from the balcony, walked back into her office, and looked at the fireproof folder on the top shelf. Every document, every stamp, every deed perfectly organized. She didn't touch them often. She didn't need to. The properties paid the bills, the tenants were happy, and the phone stayed silent from anyone who once claimed to be family. The story ended there, but Harper's life had just begun. The empire was hers, the lesson taught, and the peace hard won.